Chapter 11, Dreams and Memories. Mary read on until Colin's eyes closed, and then she got up and tiptoed out of his room. As she pushed his door shut, she froze as she heard the sound of merry laughter behind her. Swinging around, she saw two ghostly figures running up the corridor. Two young women in long white ball gowns. Her mother and Aunt Grace. They smiled at her and then vanished into thin air. Mary blinked, icy fingers running up and down her spine. Had she really just seen two ghosts? I must have imagined it, she thought, staring at the empty corridor. Mustn't I? Just then, a different noise made her jump. It was the sound of Mrs. Medlock coming upstairs again. No! She was going to be caught. Mary dashed to a nearby door on the opposite side of the corridor, to Colin's, and then turned the handle. To her relief, it opened, and she slipped inside the large room. Moonlight was shining in through the windows, bright enough for her to see that the walls were covered with detailed murals, painted scenes. The room was neat and tidy. Objects were set out around it as if they were on display. An ornate oriental screen, a wooden chest painted with flowers, display cabinets filled with carved ivory, and little elephants made out of black wood. Walking curiously around the room, Mary noticed a line of pale light on one of the walls. Going over, she realized that it was the outline of a hidden door. Excitement bubbled up inside her. Where did it lead? She carefully traced her fingers in the groove around the door until they snagged on a slightly raised piece of wood. She pressed it, and with a faint click, the door swung open. Mary caught her breath as she gazed inside. The room on the other side seemed to shine and glow with light. The moonbeams streaming in through the large window were reflecting off swatches of thick white cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. There were dressmakers' dummies arranged around the room, clothed in beautiful old-fashioned gowns, all decorated with gems that glittered brightly. Other dummies were piled with elegant cloaks and fur stoles. Mary stepped inside the room, her eyes widening in awe as she walked between the gowns, gently touching the soft, silky fabrics. There was a pile of photographs and pictures stacked against each other in the center of the room, along with boxes and boxes of photographs. Mary looked through them curiously. They were all of her mother and her aunt from when they were children, and they went all the way up through until they were adults. Her mother sitting with her twin sister's arms around her, the two sisters running through the woodland and dancing in a field. In every picture, her mother and her aunt looked so wonderfully happy. Mary paused at one of them, walking away along the path lined with beautiful flowers and statues. They were with two very young children, and they were walking hand in hand, their backs to the camera. There was another picture of them all sitting under a big oak tree that had a swing attached to one of its branches. Mary drifted away from the photographs and opened the wardrobe. It was filled with even more beautiful dresses. As she rifled through them, a few fell from the hangers and spilled onto the floor. Picking up a silver one, Mary couldn't resist. She tried it on. She slipped it over her nightclothes. It was much too big for her, but she spun around in it. Once there was a girl named Mary Lennox, she thought dreamily. She was invited to a grand ball, and when she was there, she danced and danced, and everyone thought she was beautiful. Mary whisked a feather boa from one of the dummies, sending the rest of the scarves and stoles tumbling to the floor. And then she danced over to the chest of drawers and pulled open the heavy drawers one by one. She found folded lace, the softest leather gloves, tortoiseshell hair combs, and finally a drawer of jewelry boxes. Opening one, she took out a string of pearls and put them on. She smiled at herself in the looking glass. But then a familiar cry of pain made her remember exactly where she was. It was Colin. Mrs. Medlock must be in his room, forcing him to have more of that medicine that he hated. Mary shrugged off the dress and the boa, leaving them on the floor with the rest of the clothes, and she hurried back into the first room. She listened at the door. As she did so, she put her hand to her neck. She still had on pearls. She quickly pulled them off and dropped them into the pocket of her dressing gown. She'd put them back later. Colin's screams had turned into sobbing now, and she could hear Mrs. Medlock leaving. As her footsteps echoed away down the stairs, Mary pushed the door open, intending to go to Colin, but just then a sound on the landing made her stop. She peeped out. Her uncle was walking quickly towards Colin's room from the other end of the corridor. He arrived at Colin's door and stopped. His hand reached for the door, but then he pulled it back, his face a mass of conflicting emotions. Gosh, why isn't he going in? Thought Mary in astonishment. She knew that if she had been in pain and her father were still alive, he would have rushed to her side. Taking a deep breath, her uncle ran his hand through his hair and then turned and slowly walked away, back the way he'd come. At that moment, Mary hated her uncle with a passion. Why hadn't he gone in and comforted Colin? Colin's mother might have loved him, but his father obviously didn't. With her uncle and Mrs. Medlock out and about in the corridors, Mary didn't dare risk going into Colin's room again. So instead, she hurried back to her own bedroom. So much had happened that day. Jemima being caught in the trap, finding the garden and the hidden room with all those clothes and photographs, Colin telling her that he was going to die. Mary thought about the photograph of her mother and her aunt holding hands with 2 young children. Could it possibly been her and Colin in the photo? No. Colin had said he'd never been able to walk, and the girl couldn't have been her because she'd never been to England. So who were those children? When Mary fell asleep, images filled her head. Flashes of the secret garden, the dog, the robin. She was running through the flower beds. The weeds had gone, and they were now filled with enormous bright flowers. And as she burst through them, she was suddenly in India again. Daddy was chasing her, pretending to be a monster, and she was giggling with delight. Now she was sitting on the veranda. She had an exercise book on her knee, and it was filled with writing. The door opened, and through it she could see her mother lying on the daybed. Their eyes met, and Mary felt a surge of hope. Maybe this time Mother would see her? "I've written a story, Mother," she called. "Can I read it to you?" "No, Mary, not now. Please go away," her mother said wearily. "I need some peace. I need some quiet." "But Mother, I wrote it for you." Her mother motioned to a servant in the room, and the door was shut in Mary's face. She hates me, Mary thought. 2 tears escaped and spilled down her cheeks. "Mary!" This time it was her father. He jumped up onto the veranda and saw her tears. "Oh, my monkey," he said, wiping her tears with his thumbs. "Did you want to see Mother?" Mary nodded, and he sighed. "Well, she can't. She can't see you at the moment. She's sad. But can I try and make her happy, Daddy?" He gave her a rueful smile. "I'm afraid that's not going to work, monkey. Seeing you makes her feel sad. Try not to take it to heart." Mary didn't understand. Why would the sight of her make her mother feel worse? "Your mother's sick," her father went on sadly. "She's so very sick." Mary scowled. "I wish she'd just get on and die and leave us alone then." "Mary, you mustn't speak like that," her father had said sharply. "Now, be a good girl and run along. I need to go to work now." Mary had held in her tears. She would be a good girl like her father asked, because if she wasn't, well, maybe Daddy would start shutting doors on her too and stop loving her. Just then, Mary woke up. She woke to the sound of Martha cleaning out the grate in the fireplace. "Good morning, miss," she said, giving Mary a friendly smile. Mary sat up in bed. "Good morning, Martha," said Mary. She watched the maid work for a moment. "Martha, have you worked here long?" "Yes, ever since I was 12, miss. I started here as a scullery maid. Things were very different back in them days. There were scullery maids and parlor maids, footmen and butler, stable boys." She shook her head. "Times were different then, miss." "Was that before the war?" said Mary. "Yes, and before the mistress died," said Martha quietly. "It's hard to believe now, but this house was once filled with light, laughter, and happiness." What was my Aunt Grace like? Mary asked curiously. Martha looked surprised. Didn't your mother talk about her at all? No, she never talked about England. Not that I can remember, anyway, said Mary. Well, maybe it pained her too much, said Martha with a sigh. She and the mistress, they were thick as thieves. The crying that happened when it was announced that your father was going to be sent to India. Ugh. She shook her head. I'll never forget that. I don't know how your mother coped to lose the mistress when she died, either. It must have half killed her. She stood up. Do you need anything else, miss? No, said Mary, seeing that her porridge was on the table. She smiled. I can manage now, Martha. Thank you. Looking surprised but pleased, Martha left. Mary got herself clothed, choosing a dress that had no buttons at the back, and then she sat down to eat her porridge. She thought about everything that Martha had said. She'd never realized her mother and Aunt Grace had been so close. It must have been terribly hard for her mother to leave England. Even more terrible must have been the news that Aunt Grace had died. Mary thought about the dream she'd had the night before. She knew it wasn't just a dream. It was a memory, too. She could remember waiting on that veranda and the unhappiness that had surged through her when that door had been shut in her face. But for the first time, she wondered if maybe her mother had been unhappy, too. Maybe she'd been grieving for her sister who died. Thinking that made Mary feel a little bit differently about her mother. Mary was still pondering it when she went outside. She'd managed to get some more Spam sandwiches from Cook, and she headed into the gardens. As she walked down a path, she heard a crackling behind her. Her heart thumped. Was someone following her? She slipped behind a huge oak tree and found a space underneath, a cavernous rhododendron bush. Hiding under its branches, she watched as Mrs. Medlock came past, looking suspiciously to the left and to the right. Oh, thought Mary, with a slight smile. So Mrs. Medlock is on my trail, and she thinks she's clever enough to spy on me, does she? Well, we'll see about that.